Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made.
Tyler's one of the greatest guys. He made that airplane so cheap for me, I couldn't help but buy it.
Do you really believe that human beings are demons?
No, I do not. And don't you ever say I did. We wrestle not with flesh and blood, but principalities and powers.
Good evening, folks. Kent Hovind here at Dinosaur Adventureland. How high was the IQ test? Did anybody see? 91. A little slow down here in Alabama.
Napoleon, don't be jealous that I've been chatting online with babes all day.
What's up, Raptor Baits? Welcome to the Skylar Fiction Show, where Christian apologetics comes to die. Man, guys, first of all, we're sorry. We are so sorry that we haven't got to make a video. Well, we haven't got to do a hangout.
I thought you were just mocking me by saying sorry.
No, that's so. Now that we got him out of the way for the show tonight, we'll know to do it. That is funny. Because I was off air. I made fun of Josh twice for saying sorry. No, we haven't been here, Josh. We haven't really got to hang out. I feel like my broski, like a part of me has been missing from my life, and I feel we're completing again, Josh. I feel that we're getting back to we're back to being complete, But I do think for tonight's topic, a little prayer is in order to, Raptor Jesus up there. And that is, thank you, Raptor Jesus, for with your decretive will, you preordained that this conversation would happen. This conversation on Calvinism that you wanted to happen from the very, very beginning. You planned this out to a T, and you were like, you know what? I want you guys to have this conversation. So we thank you, Raptor Jesus. Blessed be your claws. Ramen. I'm in under his claw. Okay. So
now that everyone is thoroughly uncomfortable.
Now that everyone is thoroughly uncomfortable, we've said our prayer to Raptor Jesus. We could talk about our amazing guest tonight.
I don't feel uncomfortable. Thank you for including me in your ceremonial prayer to Raptor Jesus.
I believe in my heart that one day you're gonna convert one way. You're gonna see the error of your ways, and and see the true glory
of RJ.
Of RJ, and you can you'll truly know what it means to be under his claws. So.
Okay.
Yeah,
anyways,
this is being used as the means to either elect or reprobate him.
Exactly.
The clause. It was the clause.
Raptor Jesus works in miraculous ways. Okay. Anyways, let's introduce our guest. Let's start with One Way Apologetics, Sola de Gloria. Say hello. Tell us a little bit about yourself and where people can find more videos from you.
What in the name of me?
First of all, thank you, Floyd. Dr. Josh for working all that technical stuff, and Skylar for having me on again. Last time I was on, I was complaining about something like maybe I should come on for a less complex topic, but it seems here we are again. We got to stop. I'm repeating the same thing I said. But yeah, I have two YouTube channels, One Way and Sole Deo Gloria, and you can find me there. I usually do more Christian-oriented videos, not so much apologetic. Some of them are. So I mean that's what I'm about. Really, what my impetus and what drives me is edification for believers and unbelievers alike. So there it is. I think that's what I would give you there.
All right. Thank you, my man. And Floyd, what's up, my brother? Please tell us a little bit about yourself, where people might find more stuff from you.
Thanks, Skylar and Dr. Josh. Thanks One Way for joining the show. I'm I'm Floyd FP. I've been part of like the Great Debate community for, I don't know, quite a few years. I used to be on Google Plus, like a lot of us were. I do have a YouTube channel, Floyd FP. I don't have a lot of like original content. Well, I shouldn't say that. What I usually use my channel for is I'll like mirror other shows I've been on. So it's like I'll just like whatever show I'm on, I'll just make a copy of it and throw it on my channel. I rarely do like an original show myself, but you can check out all my presentations, debates, and so forth. It's usually centered around apologetics or Bible criticism and things like that. People usually love my presentations on presuppositionalism and my engagements with Darth Dawkins and stuff like that. So you can check me out there. I'm also on Facebook as well, and I recently have gone to Discord, so I'm on some Discord servers as well. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, we're excited tonight. And what we're going to do is Floyd has basically created a presentation on Calvinism. And of course, we wanted to make sure we had a Calvinist in the room that could also kind of look over this. And we're going to have a discussion based on the presentation Floyd has created. He put a lot of effort, a lot of work into this. I don't know. Well, no one in the room has seen this presentation yet. So I'm super excited to see it. So we're just going to get it started. If you guys have any questions, throw them up in the chat over here, and we'll get started with the presentation. We'll jump in when we need it. All right, my man Floyd, let's hear the awesome presentation.
All right, it should be up now. Can you see it?
Yep.
All right, great. I cut it down as much as I can. I rehearsed it I think 2 times, and the last time I did it, if without interruption, it's about a half hour. So I don't want to put your audience to sleep. But I know we want to do commentary too. So I'll try to go through the slides as quickly as possible. But again, if anyone wants to comment or has questions, or if I make a mistake or anything, feel free to jump in. So I don't want it to be a monologue, but I'm going to hurry through the slides. It's somewhat fast paced, so I don't put the audience to sleep. So I'll get started. So we're going to talk about Calvinism. What is Calvinism? Calvinism is a Reformed Protestant theological system developed from the teachings of John Calvin and other theologians. A major doctrine of Calvinism is what's called divine sovereignty. That is, that God is in control over all of his creation. God decrees all things according to his will. John Calvin writes, "Behold, that God is the disposer and ruler of all things, that by his providence, not heaven and earth and inanimate creatures only, but also the counsels and wills of men are so governed as to move exactly in the course which he has destined." And that includes the wills of thieves and murderers and other evildoers. In fact, the first man fell because the Lord deemed it meet that he should. I guess the way they converted from French or whatever doesn't always translate that well. Calvinists often refer to Ephesians 1:11, which says, "In him, according to the purpose of him who accomplished all things according to the counsel of his will." And Proverbs 16:33 says, "The lot is cast in the lap, but the decision is wholly from the Lord." So when you roll a pair of dice and it comes up 9, God actually preordained that. So so his will is preordained even down to a dice roll. Another important doctrine of Calvinism is called predestination. And that means God has decreed and predestined the elect and the reprobate. The elect basically is those who are saved, and the reprobate are ones that God passed by to not to be saved. I'll go in more detail a little later about that. John Calvin again writes, "By destination we mean the eternal decree of God, by which he determined with himself whatever he wished to happen with regards to every man. All are not created on equal terms, but some are preordained to eternal life, others to eternal damnation. And accordingly, as each has been created for one or the other of these ends, we say that he has predestined to life or to death. Again, I ask, whence does it happen that Adam's fall irremediably involved so many peoples together with their infant offspring in eternal death, unless because it so pleased God? The decree is dreadful indeed, I confess, yet no one can deny that God foreknew what end man was to have before he created them, and consequently foreknew because he so foreordained by his decree. And it ought not to seem absurd for me to say that God not only foresaw the fall of the first man, and in him the ruin of his descendants, but also meted it out in accordance with his own decision. So God decided that Adam would fall, and thus make all of his offspring, namely us and everyone who's lived, in a depraved state. This is reflected in the Westminster Confession of Faith in chapter 3, article 3 and 4. It says, by the decree of God for the manifestation of his glory, so men and angels are predestined unto everlasting life, and others foreordained to everlasting death. These angels and men, thus predestined and foreordained, and particularly and unchangeably designed, and their number is so certain and definite that it cannot be either increased or diminished. So this is sort of, this shows the sovereignty and the predestination that God has over everything. The last term I'm going to go over is what's called is regeneration. That's God sovereignly and actively changes the person before he gives them the gift of faith, so they are now able to believe when God gives them faith. God brings Christians a new born-again life from a previous state of depravity. All right, the 5 points of Calvinism. It's can be summed up in a mnemonic called TULIP. The mnemonic also is known as the doctrines of grace, which is supposed to summarize the canons of Dort. So this is basically a summary of what Calvinists believe as far as soteriology, which is the study of the doctrine of salvation. How is someone saved? Number one is total depravity or total inability. This says, because of our corrupt nature, humans are totally unable to love and obey God. By our own sinful nature, we are dead in sin and lack the ability to follow God and be saved. Next is unconditional election. By his grace, God has freely chosen to save some humans by his mercy and chose to withhold his grace from others regardless of their own efforts and merit. So it has nothing to do with the works of man. It's unconditional. It's just up to God to decide who he saves and who he passes by for salvation. Limited atonement. Jesus' atonement on the cross is limited to God's elect only. It is not intended for the reprobate. So, God wanted Jesus to atone for someone. He's not going to atone for reprobates because they were predestined for damnation anyway. So God's not going to waste, atonement on something that's not going to work. So it's limited to just the elect. Irresistible grace. The elect has no choice but to accept God's grace for salvation. And then finally, the preservation of the saints. The chosen elect will always remain so and cannot be changed to become a reprobate. So you probably heard once saved, always saved. There's no way for an elect to backslide. If someone does backslide, well, they were never the elect to begin with. So does anyone want to add anything more onto this?
This might be. Can do me a favor, Floyd, as we go into the discussion aspect of it, just unshare for a moment. So that way it goes back to our main screen where we can see all four of us. Thank you, brother.
Yeah.
So we don't screw up the resolution, right?
Well,
It's gonna
one of
make
the things
hard
like
on Dr. Josh.
well, there's a pet peeve I have with I see shows where like they just put like they just leave the presentation up, like, but they're not even reading the presentation instead of letting the people want to see and hear the people's voices. I'm like, let's give them something. Anyways, what's your thoughts so far? One way.
Well, I think Floyd has outlined it in a roughly or rigid, well manner. I don't think he's tried to straw man Calvinism or anything like that so far. But I would ask the question in a different way. For example, Richard A. Muller, a theological and historian, writes in his book Accommodation, Calvinism, and then Oliver Crisp makes the same argument in his book, Calvinism Broadening the Reformed Perspective, that as soon as you start to utilize Calvin's institutes, that you immediately arise at a problem, namely that anybody who disagrees with Calvin's institutes is not a Calvinist, or that you couldn't use those to determine whether somebody adheres to Calvinism. Another concern that I would have, basically it would make John Calvin the only Calvinist if you use that standard. The other concern, and it's outlined in these same books, these same sources that I just briefly cited, is that thankfully Floyd did say, right, and I appreciate this about his presentation, that it's part of a broader cultural context. So when Richard A. Muller asked the question, what is a Calvinist, or what is Calvinism, in his book, he says that it's generally answered in one of three ways. I just gave you the first one, which makes John Calvin the only Calvinist. And then the second one would be, maybe it's according to the teachings of Calvin's students that determines what makes one a Calvinist or an adherent of Calvinism. And in this case, it's sort of weird because, as you said, Floyd, I think in the first slide, it derives out of the Reformation movement. These people viewed themselves as sort of reforming the Catholic faith and looking at it in the cultural context as correcting or bringing back the original Catholic tradition. So the second option fails because historically there are examples where some of his earliest followers, like Theodore Beza and others, were called Calvinists, and then they actually denied that sort of a term. And so when we ask the question, which sort of places us back in the first position, right? This is Richard A. Muller's work. There's a third aspect of this, right? So then if those two options fail, when we try to ask the question, what is a Calvinist or what is Calvinism? The third option seems to be the alleged 5 points of Calvinism. And Richard A. Muller goes through this option as well. But the modern day tulip, Floyd, doesn't reflect anything that John Calvin wrote, at least not accurately, and it doesn't line up very well with the Synod of Dort 5 points, which were just responses to Arminians and the Remonstrants.
Yeah.
I'm almost done here. So just to summarize, I think from my perspective, when I say I'm a Calvinist, I mean Reformed. So I use those as synonyms, and I think what would be helpful. And you did do this, in some of your previous slides, was citing international confessions. Like the Synod of Dort was an international meeting of people who are all confessional, which is good. But I mean, other than I think 3 or 4 points there, not to pun on the 5 points of Calvinism or something like that. The rest of what you just presented us was pretty good, pretty accurate.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think a good question to ask was John Calvin a Calvinist?
Right.
I think Calvinism has developed a lot since his time. Like, he didn't develop the tulip himself. Obviously, it was developed from his teachings and others and stuff. But to say, Calvin would be a modern day Calvinist, well, maybe, but Calvinism has developed a lot since his time.
Yeah. I mean, other than those things, I think your slide is pretty accurate, pretty good so far.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to be basically quoting all Calvinists. I don't think I quote any Arminians at all. Maybe I'll have to see. Maybe 1 or 2, but I think majority of them are Calvinists.
Okay, let's go forward then. Yeah.
All right. In Protestantism, there's more than just Calvinism. The top competitor, so to speak, of Calvinism is Arminianism. And just to contrast them, Arminianism asserts that even though they're in a fallen state, humans possess libertarian free will to accept or reject the gospel. The election is conditional on their decision to repent and believe, that atonement is universally available for all men, and that God's grace can be resisted. Prevenient grace is what Armenians usually use, Wesleyan. And people can fall from grace. So I hope you can see kind of the opposite between Calvinism and Arminianism. And just quickly, in between the two, so to speak, is Molinism, and attempts to reconcile the philosophical problems associated with God's sovereignty and the notion of libertarian free will, where God uses his middle knowledge to choose a possible world for men to be saved. It's a lot more complex than this, but in the sake of time, I just wanted to mention it. People like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga are supporters of Molinism. But usually you'll see a lot of debates between Calvinists and Arminians. You find plenty of them on the internet. There's a lot of ranges between all of them. So this is a slide I put together myself. I was actually searching the internet for something better. I really couldn't find it. I started something very conservative, hyper-Calvinism, and there's even different branches within hyper-Calvinism to lower forms of Calvinism down to moderate. There's 4-point Calvinism. In the tulip, they don't like the L. They don't like the limited atonement. So they're 4-point Calvinists. In Arminianism, there's different branches and so forth. And from there, it kind of gets more liberal and more universal. Platonism, open theism is interesting. Open theism asserts that the future is not knowable, that God doesn't even know the future. God can make a pretty good guess of the future, since he has a lot more knowledge than we do, but not even he knows the future. And then universalism. Universalism asserts that everyone's saved, that Jesus died on the cross for everyone, and what do you know, it worked. So you can see the wide range of different soteriological viewpoints within Christianity. Another doctrine in Calvinism is what's called double predestination, and a lot of people kind of get this term confused or misinterpret it. But the way I understand it is double predestination asserts that God positively and actively decrees election, while asymmetrically passes over the reprobate, leaving them in their already depraved state that leads to a just damnation.
Right. That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, R.C. Sproul writes, to the non-elect, God withholds his monergistic work of grace, passing them by and leaving them to themselves. Something that he calls positive negative predestination. So positive on election, but negative on reprobation.
Right. So it would be like passive versus impassive, sort of.
Right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
God actively elects people, where he doesn't actively reprobate them. He just leaves them as they are, which is a totally depraved state since birth. And then there's something which some people get confused, and they mix double predestination with equal ultimacy. What equal ultimacy is asserts that God positively and actively decrees both symmetrically the elect to salvation and the reprobate to damnation. So it's R.C. Sproul calls it positive predestination. It's a more hyper Calvinist view. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. All right. And what involves these two forms of predestination is something called lapsarianism. Well, lapsarianism is the study of the logical order of decrees around the fall of Adam and Eve. So these are not about when they happen; it's about when God decrees them. And this is not in not a temporal order, but a logical order, since God is eternal outside of time. It's from the Latin root lapsus, meaning fall, and there's kind of like two camps. One is supralapsarianism, and that's the view that God's decrees of election and reprobation logically preceded the decree of the fall. And then there's infralapsarianism, and that's the view that God's decree of election and reprobation logically succeeded the decree of the fall. So simply put, supralapsarianism asserts that
just to say real quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I would fall into the infra camp, but go ahead, Floyd. Yeah.
Yeah. Simply put, supralapsarianism asserts that God damned the non-elect and caused the fall to ensure it, while infralapsarianism asserts that God caused the fall and then damned the non-elect because of it. So basically, hyper Calvinists go to supralapsarianism, and the controversy here is that even before sin entered the world, God decreed the elect and the reprobate, even before he decreed sin. And, so the issue here is that if sin is the cause of reprobation, you have it's a problem, because God already predetermined who would be the elect and who would be the reprobate even before he decreed sin.
Or even the creation. Yeah,
right. Yeah, I mean, this is before the creation. This, God's eternal, right? This is the logical order, not the temporal order. So it's not like God decrees something in time and then goes down, see what happens, and then based on that he makes another decree. No, he designed this since before the foundations of the earth. So again, this is a logical order, not a temporal order. So both views are. And as you mentioned, the majority of Calvinists, usually the high or the moderate Calvinists low, they go with infralapsarianism. So they believe, God decreed the fall, which made sin enter the world, and then from there he decreed the elect and the reprobate. Both views are controversial, and a majority of I should just read my slide. The majority of Calvinists are infralapsarians, and some will take no position at all. And I don't blame them, because again, this is a logical order. God isn't thinking sequentially here. So does it really matter the order, a whole lot? I don't think it really does matter. It's not like one had higher priority over the other. So some Calvinists, basically ignore this issue because they don't think it's really that relevant.
Yeah, a good example of this would be Robert Raymond and his systematic theology. He takes a different view. He thinks it's worthless to argue in for a supra, precisely because of what you said. Like, yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, I agree. Because again, this is not a temporal order. This is, God decreed all of it, right? So, and when he decrees one, it's like he doesn't know the other. I mean, they're all intermeshed. I mean, this is his design. But I think a lot of moderate to lower Calvinists, since they believe more in more of conditional reprobation, sin is the cause of it. So they want to view sin as preceding the decree for election and reprobation. All right. So basically, what this all boils down to is divine sovereignty versus human free will. So I bring up some questions that I think we need to talk about. The first one is: if God is sovereign over all things, is God the author of sin and evil? Since he designed everything to the beginning. Next question is: does God deny humans their free will? And then lastly, is reprobation as unconditional as election is? So I'm gonna go over what Calvinists usually generally believe about this, and then then we can go into a deeper dive in the discussion of it. Many moderate to lower Calvinists answer no to these questions. So they say, no, God is not the author of sin. God does not deny human free will, and reprobation is not as unconditional as election is. Moderate and lower Calvinists generally reject libertarian free will, but they affirm a compatibilist view of free will. So I don't know if you want to talk any more about that. I hope I kind of represented, what majority of Calvinists believe.
Yeah. So question one, I mean, it does depend on the Calvinist you're talking to as well, right? Like,
yeah.
I wouldn't want to misrepresent your view on free will or something like that. I think God's sovereignty falls under the category of God's providence, the way that he orders things. And historically, that does seem to be an important demarcation. For example, there's a tremendous difference between Luther's view, which seems to be necessitarian, and John Calvin's view. I don't know if you've read John Calvin's approach to this issue of free will, but he basically grudgingly conceded it around 1943 before his final version of the Institutes was published against a person named, I don't even know if I'm probably going to murder this, Pughis, Pughis.
Yeah, I heard it pronounced Higley sometimes.
Yeah. Do me a favor, stop screen sharing for a second.
Okay.
Floyd. Thank you, buddy. Sorry, please continue, guys.
Yeah, I've heard it pronounced Pigley at times, but it's like Lius. So it's
He wrote some article around like 1543 or something like that, where I think it was called De Libertum Arbitrio or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm not a good Latin speaker, but he basically, Calvin conceded that there's some kind of free will prior to his final publication. Now the other two questions I can't see anymore. So what were they, Floyd?
Oh, let me bring it back up. Yeah, Cornelius Van Til, in his reply to Dr. Buswell, brought up the dialogue between Calvin and Pigley, and mentioned the ultimate or remote cause of sin and the proximate or second causes of will, and Cornelius Van Til basically went along with Calvin's view, versus Pigley.
Right. So like even Van Til conceded, which is weird because you have like hyper Calvinists like Gordon Clark, who is famous, name in presuppositionalism,
Yeah.
who goes against that.
Yeah, he's a
so-
super lapsarian.
Right. He would be like a superlapsarian, like he said.
Yeah.
So does God deny humans their free will? Sort of like I was saying earlier, this is a lot broader. And I want to give you a quick response. I myself adhere to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And prior to 3.3, it says clearly in 3.1 that God has ordained whatsoever comes to pass in such a way that neither is violence offered to the will, nor the liberty, nor the secondary causation taken away in the same chapter. It's like, so I think that at least in the Westminster Confession of Faith, it's broad enough to allow at least certain forms of source incompatibilistic versions of free will. I mean, for people who don't study this philosophically, there are all sorts of views on free will. My own is semi-compatibilism. If you guys are interested in my view, you can read about it. And Floyd, I'd like to send you the book, Skylar and Josh as well, from John Martin Fisher, called Deep Control: Essays on Free Will. So to me, it looks like the Westminster Confession of Faith, at least along with the London Baptist Confession of Faith, seem to afford considerable latitude. So what I do want to ask is the third question. What was the third question, Floyd?
I have the Westminster Confession of Faith 3.1 right here. So it's right in my next slide.
Yeah.
Next one is reprobation as unconditional as election is?
Yeah. This is a great question. Calvin's views seem to be in the Institutes that predestination to salvation, as you said, was passing over the non-elect, but it's not entirely clear in modern circles what he meant by that. But I would appeal to Ephesians 1, just as Calvin did. It seems to be being elected in what Christ accomplished for us. In other words, Christ is our federal head, just as Adam was our federal head. So it's not like some sort of a mechanistic sort of a thing. What John Calvin called this in his Institutes was union with Christ. So that's my view. Obviously, there are different views. But did you have any questions about any of those things, Floyd?
No, I just want to bring that up. And I think, okay. I guess those are the discussion topics that will go forward. But I do offer what Calvinists generally believe about these three questions. So I can go on the next slide. Is God the author of sin? John Calvin says, man falls according to God's providence ordains, but he falls by his own fault. And in the Westminster Confession of Faith 3.1, it says, God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordains whatever comes to pass, yet so, as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. Second causes are human causes. First causes are obviously from God. So here it says God ordained everything unchangeably, yet God is not the author of sin. How does that make sense? So I'll go a little farther. Yet we are told in the Westminster Confession of Faith 6.1, our first parents, being seduced by subtlety and temptation of Satan, sinned in eating the forbidden fruit. This their sin, God was pleased, according to his wise and holy counsel, to permit, having purposed to order it to his own glory. Calvinists often refer to James 1:13 through 14. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. but each one is tempted when, by his own evil desire, he is dragged away and enticed. All right. So here we have God ordaining everything, yet according to Westminster Confession of Faith and John Calvin and others, God is not the author of sin. How do we make sense of that? The founding leader of the Westminster Theological Seminary, J. Gresham Machen, states the problem. We have said that God has foreordained whatever comes to pass. The sinful actions of sinful men are things that come to pass. Yet, there's that yet word again. We've seen that a lot. We deny that God is the author of them, and we put the responsibility for them upon man. How could we possibly do that? Are we not involved? Are we not involving ourselves in hopeless contradiction? How can a holy God, if he is all powerful, have permitted the existence of sin? That's from what is Predestination. Only $6 on Amazon, by the way.
Go pick it up, guys.
The answer is found in the fact that although God foreordains whatever comes to pass, he causes the bringing to those things to pass in widely different ways. He does not cause them to do those things against their will, but he determines their will, and their freedom as persons is fully preserved when they perform those acts. The acts remain their acts, even though they were led to do them by the Spirit of God. Okay, that's interesting. So God determines their will, but they do things according to the will that God determines. He goes on.
Right. Maybe I can just give you an interjection here. In the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 5, it says that God does that. Either he causes all things to fall out as, using means to an end, either necessarily, contingently, or freely. And so, so then the question is, are they all fated? I think that's what J. Gresham Machen is getting at here when he goes into chapter 6 of the Westminster Confession. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay. He continues. Let me go. Yeah. Okay. Oops. The next slide. I think this is. Yeah. He does not tempt the men to sin. He does not influence them to sin, but he causes the bringing to pass of those deeds by free and responsible choices of personal beings. He has created those beings with the awful gift of freedom of choice. The things that they do in exercise of that gift are their acts. They do not indeed surprise God by the doing of them, yet their doing in them is part of his eternal plan. Yet, in the doing of them, they, not the holy God, are responsible. Okay. Well, we have to explain that a little further.
It would take a while to explain that. Go ahead, Floyd.
Yeah. What is the real difficulty here? Is it the difficulty of harmonizing the free will of the creature with the certainty of the creature's actions as part of God's eternal plan? Eternal purpose? No, I don't think that's a real difficulty. The real difficulty is the difficulty of seeing how a good and all-powerful God ever could have allowed sin to enter the world that he has created. That difficulty faces not only the consistent and truly biblical view of the divine decree, which we have tried to summarize this afternoon. I believe this is a radio broadcast, but it also faces the inconsistent views that we have rejected. I think he's talking about Arminianism here. It can never be used, therefore, as an argument in favor as one of those inconsistent views against the consistent view. For both, the problem remains: how could a holy God, if he is all-powerful, have ever permitted the existence of sin? What shall we do with this problem? I'm afraid we shall have to do with it something that we are not very that is not very pleasing to our pride. I'm afraid that we're just going to have to say that it's insolvable. You want to add on anything more onto that? Apparently we have an insolvable problem here.
Sure. Yeah, I would just add in the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 2, it clearly says that Adam was created mutable. That is, with the ability to sin, what Augustine called non posse peccare. And then as a result of what he did, that is, Adam is our federal head, or, sort of our representative, if you will. As a result of what he did, we were plunged. I mean, this is just Augustinian here, Augustinianism. So that there is a sense in which God is the author of sin, and the sense in which that's the case is that he created people with the ability to sin, at least according to the Westminster Confession of Faith, right? So we could ask, and I don't want to dissolve the issue in that way, right? You could ask the question, like I asked Skylar in our dialogue. Why couldn't he have just created people to only will the good, or something like that from the beginning? So there are definitely issues here. There are entire books written on this, but I understand where people get this. So what is meant by God is not the author of sin here? Well, what they're saying is that it's not God himself who sinned. I don't know if you've read Guilherme Bignon's book. I tried to pass along to you. It's sort of a categorical error. It would be like equivalent to me blaming the author of Tolkien's book with what his characters in the stories do. But it still doesn't, you know what I mean, Floyd?
I have read that. Yeah, I have
that still doesn't
heard that analogy before, yeah.
That still doesn't dissolve the problem. I mean, it's still there. So I don't want to get rid of the whole problem. So the question becomes, in what sense is he, in what sense is he not the author of sin? Well, I think what we're saying, I think what the Westminster Confession divines are saying is that he himself is not the one who sinned.
Yeah, he created their will in which they would sin.
Right.
This way, author like Tolkien would invent evil characters to do evil things, but the author themselves is not doing those things.
Right. We wouldn't hold Tolkien responsible for the what his characters do in his novel. But yeah. So there is a sense in which God is the author of evil. I do want to admit that. I mean, there's evil in this world, and God could have, at least it's logically possible, right? That could, for example, he could have just created us all in heaven to begin with. So when, that's something that has to be fleshed out more and thought about more.
Okay. I'll move on. Calvinist theologian C. Michael Patton says, well, while I believe in free will, I do not believe in libertarian free will. We make the choices we make because of who we are. We are responsible for these choices. God will judge each person according to a righteous judgment. Is there tension? Absolutely. We hold in tension our belief in God's sovereignty, determining who we are, when we live, where we will live, who our parents will be, our DNA, etc., and human responsibility. Well, this might seem uncomfortable. I believe that is the only best biblical option, but the only philosophical option outside of fatalism. and we don't want to go there. Okay, that seems like a
right. So
to
explain to the audience what fatalism is philosophically is that event X happens regardless of means to that end. So like there's literally nothing you can do about it. But yes.
Yeah, it's fate. You can't change fate. So you have fate, and I guess in fate is kind of like impersonal, right? Where in
Right.
Calvinism we have an agent behind behind these acts for a reason.
Right. But you as a skeptic could still, sort of say the same thing, right? If this is part of God's plan, how is that different from fate? See, like with the Stoics, It was like nature fatalism or something like that.
Right. So the late R.C. Sproul writes, if there is one single molecule in this universe running around loose, totally free of God's sovereignty, then we have no guarantee that a single promise of God will ever be fulfilled. Perhaps that one maverick molecule will lay waste in all the grand and glorious plans that God has made and promised to us. If it is true that in some sense God foreordains everything that comes to pass, then it follows with no doubt that God must have foreordained the entrance of sin into the world. That is not to say that God forced it to happen or that he imposed evil upon his creation. All that means is that God must have decided to allow it to happen. In spite of this excruciating problem, we must affirm that God is not the author of sin. It seems like, I just have to say that it just seems like these Calvinist theologians are just dead set on not having God be responsible for the entrance of sin, putting it all on man. But time and time again, God has foreordained these things. He foreordained the fall. He created our nature. John Calvin, R.C. Sproul calls this an excruciating problem. Mackin says it's insolvable. So, it's really hard to grasp, why we can't say God is responsible for what he has created.
Right. No, I don't want to diminish the importance of that. Like I said, there are lots of books written on this. Lots of people are struggling with this issue. I think what, in the best words I can put this, though, what you have is like sort of an extreme spectrum, right? If you go to the complete libertarian view, you have to say that it was like a random quirk in your brain that made you rob a bank, which is indiscernible from an accident. If you go to the other extreme and say, well, it's all determined, well, then it seems like you shouldn't be held responsible. So the only solution I could give you for this, aside from affirming that the Westminster Confession of Faith affirms both contingency and non-contingency, as anti-Calvinist authors like Jerry Walls have written books on, is sort of what I cited earlier, semi-compatibilism. And I think it's even possible for a natural or a non-theistic person to affirm the semi-compatibilist position, which just basically says that free will, or more importantly, moral praise and blame are compatible with either indeterminism or indeterminism, which is a lot broader. But I would refer you again to that book by John Martin Fisher. It's definitely a struggle, Floyd, for me, right? Thinking about God determining some like rape or something like that, or being in control of that, is it's definitely a hard issue to think about. So I don't want to mitigate that in any way. I certainly don't want to say I approve of it.
Yeah, and the Calvinist view of free will would the compatibilist view of free will is deterministic, right? Because it's determined by God.
Well, right. I'm not a compatibilist. Some Calvinists and Reformed theologians are. Okay, my view is semi-compatibilism. I look at the Bible and I find indeterministic passages, and I find deterministic passages. I don't cherry pick. I try to make sense of how those things work together, and I think that semi-compatibilism does that, because at the end of the day, it reduces to when you're talking about the issue of free will, what it reduces to is how do you fit moral responsibility into either end of that spectrum. In the view that I'm proposing, semi-compatibilism, it basically says that moral responsibility is compatible with both indeterminism and determinism.
I find it. I mean, what would be indeterministic? I don't understand how a Calvinist could even entertain that thought.
Well, sure. The Westminster Confession of Faith says God, according to his foreknowledge, right, causeth all things to work out using means, either necessarily, contingently, or freely. So within the Calvinist system, there's this, what Richard Muller calls synchronistic contingency idea. At least that's the way the scholastics argued about it. So there's like a dialectic here within Reformed theology. So I was actually just trying to propose a model that maybe an unbeliever could even use, because oftentimes, Floyd, like you, I don't know if I think you've been in many different conversations. I haven't been in many conversations with you, but you've been in many conversations with Christians who might use free will like sort of like a beating branch against atheism, and then trying to reduce it to materialism. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. In a similar manner, I think it's reductionistic to say that the Reformed tradition has to be only deterministic here.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to, maybe if you can point me to a book, but I mean, the analogy I use is like an Armenian would say that God created lemonade out of lemons, right?
See, that's the thing, that even the Armenians were part of the Reformed tradition in the Synod of Dort time period.
Yeah, and I would think a Calvinist would say, no, God foreordained those lemons to be lemonade.
Right.
I think that would be the difference between the two.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So okay, let me continue on. So I'm not going to quote an Armenian here. I'm going to go the opposite way and quote a hyper-Calvinist. Vincent Chung states, when Reformed Christians are questioned on whether God is the author of sin, they are quick to say, no, God is not the author of sin. Then they twist and turn and writhe on the floor, trying to give man some power of self-determination, some kind of freedom that renders them culpable, and yet still leave God in his total sovereignty. On the other hand, when someone alleges that my view of divine sovereignty makes God the author of sin, my first reaction tends to be, so what? Those who oppose me stupidly chant, but he makes God the author of sin. He makes God the author of sin. However, description does not amount to an argument or objection. I have never come across a decent explanation as to what is wrong with God being the author of sin in any theological or philosophical work written by anyone from any perspective. Whether or not God is the author of sin, there is no biblical or rational problem with him being the author of sin. After this, he exegetes James 1, 13, which I
If
quoted
I could just
earlier.
if I could just interject real quick here, Floyd,
Sure.
because it's amazing. Like he just dismisses it, right? It's amazing how he does that. He doesn't give it any thought. He just says, "So what?" Okay, so what? We could just say, "So what?" back to him. I think the question is God somehow the author of sin, or let's use the doctrine of providence here. Is he somehow controlling sin in a way that is inappropriate? If we were going to be precise, that's the way that I would go about thinking about it, right? So if we say, is God the author of sin? Well, God made people with free will, so in some sense he is. But does that mean he makes people sin everywhere? That's like question 1B or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so over here on this other end, Richard Chung just like dismisses it like it shouldn't even be thought about. So to me, it seems like if we were to formulate this more clearly, we would say, is God inappropriately involved in sin, right?
Okay. He goes on to say, contrary to the typical response, Paul does not say, you don't understand. Although God determines all things, he causes all things only to having you freely make decisions according to your own nature, which came from Adam, whose nature mysteriously turned from holy to evil, so that God is not the author of sin, but so that you are responsible for your own decisions and actions. Instead, Paul says that God's control over both the noble and the common is as the potter's control over the lump of clay. And just as a lump of clay cannot question a potter, Paul's response to the objector is not, but you made yourself evil, but you freely perform evil according to your own nature. But instead, he says, shall the creature say to the creator, why did you make me like this? And Paul does not say, but God is not the author of sin, but instead he says, God has the right to make one person righteous and another person evil, to save one and damn another. Of course, no one can resist his will. But who are you to talk back? And this is obviously from Romans 9.
Right. Yeah, it's a famous proof text of Calvinists. I would just, I think that Paul is drawing on the Old Testament background, Floyd. If you've read the Egyptian Book of the Dead or ancient Near Eastern literature, this hardening of the heart stuff is actually in reference to the afterlife. It's used in Exodus 7 through chapter 7 through 9. And it seems to be in response to what people are doing. If you read the Exodus account in chapters 2 through 3. So it's not so much what's going on in this life, but it's highlighting what goes on in this life is more importantly going on, retrospectively in the afterlife. Does that make sense? So, for example, Exodus 33, Jeremiah 18, these sorts of background passages. So I think Paul has in mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but Paul's talking about, the condition of man, why we live, right? God, we're totally depraved because of the fall, and it's only in our nature, to perform evil, and in asking, well, why were we made this way? Paul doesn't, say, oh well, God created you this way. No, Paul flat out says, God can create you wherever he however he wants to make you, and who are you? Who are you? A mere man to question God. Just the way God said to Job. God said the same thing to Job. God's response to Job. Were you there when I created the foundations of the earth? Only when you basically equal my might will I answer you. And here's Paul saying the same thing. who are you? I made you, just like a potter makes pots out of a lump of clay. So Paul really doesn't give an answer here. He just says,
Right. It's a hypothetical question. Yeah.
yeah, he just says, who are you to talk back? All right, let me continue on. All right, okay, that's it for the author of Sin. Let's move on to the doctrine of unconditional reprobation. Some Calvinists consider it as the logically necessary complement to unconditional election. So if election is unconditional, so is reprobation. Dr. Derek W.H. Thomas of the Reformed Theological Seminary states, what is more important is that reprobation is as unconditional as election is. In this decree, God did indeed foresee that man is sinful because God has already decreed the entrance of sin. But man's sin is not the final cause of reprobation, only the instrumental cause. And God is the first and final cause of all things, including therefore election, and including therefore reprobation. If men were reprobated because of their sin, then all men would be reprobated because all men are sinners. So sin is only the means in which God condemns people, according to Dr. Derek Thomas. This is very much in line with supralapsarianism.
Go ahead, Floyd. Sorry.
And so God is the final cause of all things, including sin and evil. So, and this is more of a supralapsarian view, or at least compatible with that view. So the idea is, if I murder someone with a gun, the gun, you're saying, guns don't kill people, people kill people. So, in this case, the gun is the instrument in which I killed the person, but I'm the true cause. The first.
Or you could say it this way, Floyd, like you're a part of the category of people who make guns. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And there's was it Aristotle's four causes?
Right.
You can go through.
Yeah, and the metaphysics. Yeah.
Yeah. Barry Gritters writes that reprobation is unconditional, is seen in more than one place, and he offers some verses. I cut it short because I had to cut this presentation down, where Professor Robert L.
I already see Robert Raymond, so I'm loving this.
Yeah,
I'm glad to see that you're reading this stuff.
Yeah, where Professor Robert L. Raymond takes the opposite view, and he says, he took into account the condition which alone deserves his wrath and their sin. So here's two opposite views within Calvinism. All right. So the question is, how do we deal with these opposites? We have, God's sovereignty, controlling everything down to the fall, down to the roll of the dice, and human will. Dr. Michael S. Horton writes, often detractors define Reformed theology not according to what it actually teaches, but according to where they think it logically naturally leads. Even more tragically, some hyper-Calvinists have followed the same course. Either way, Calvinism ends up being defined by extreme positions that it does not in fact hold as scriptural. Scripture sets forth two guardrails here. On one hand, God works all things after the counsel of his own will, Ephesians 1:11. On the other hand, God does not, in fact, cannot do evil. The challenge is to affirm what Scripture teaches without venturing any further. We know from Scripture that both are true, but not how. Here, once again, we are faced with mystery, and the two guardrails that keep us from careening off the cliffs in speculation. God loves the world and calls everyone in the world to Christ outwardly through the gospel. And yet, there's yet again, God loves the elect and with saving purpose and calls them by his Spirit inwardly through the same gospel. Both Arminians and hyper-Calvinists ignore the crucial passage of Scripture, resolving the mystery in favor of either election or the free offer of the gospel. So I think it's a good quote, which that illustrates the tension between both sides.
Yeah, I don't know what.
Yeah, and the issue is, you start with the tulip, for example, and then you just see where that logically leads,
Right?
And that can lead to to certain views, which might contradict other theological positions or Scripture.
Right. But as I said, as Robert A. Mueller has argued, and other people, the tulip doesn't bear very much significance to the Synod of Dort, the original historical 5 points of Calvinism. Like it didn't even exist until the 20th century or so. And so that's something to keep in mind. So like from my position, Floyd, historically, the L is like the most contested one, right? In the tulip. You can go back as far as the hypothetical universalists, Moises Meritov, or you can go further to Theodore Beza, who appeared to be espousing Molinism, yet he was called a Calvinist. Like he seems to be in the Reformed tradition, but there seems to be enough leeway for even a Molinist like him to be considered a Calvinist, which wouldn't surprise me. Alvin Plantinga is a person who considers himself to be Reformed.
Yeah. All right. John Calvin addresses this, how it was ordained by the foreknowledge and decree of God what man's future was without God being implicated as associate in the fault as the author and approver of transgression, is clearly a secret, so much excelling the insight of the human mind that I am not ashamed to confess ignorance. I daily meditate on these mysteries of his judgments, that curiosity to know anything more does not attract me. So he confesses ignorance, in regards to this issue.
Right. At least in my case, I gave you a resolution to the how, instead of appealing to mystery, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could have a semi-compatibilist view, which is, at least in my estimation, compatible not only with theism but atheism even. Seems you could have a semi-compatibilistic view on determinism and free will, and it's sort of like you just got done saying, Floyd. It's like steering between the great cliffs on your right side and your left side. We don't want to go to hard determinism. We don't want to go to hard indeterminism. And so I think it's somewhere in between there. Otherwise, we destroy all moral responsibility.
Okay. All right. I think we're actually near the end. So I actually got through. I think I'm going to actually get through all my slides, which is great. Okay. So this is my conclusion. This is my view. Okay. Calvinists are left divided on important issues such as who is the author of sin, the level of free will humans have, and the role God plays in reprobation. My view is that God, the God of Calvinism, is the author of sin and evil because he predestined and foreordained everything that comes to pass, including the acts of thieves, murderers, and other evildoers for his own glory and is pleased to do so. The God of Calvinism restricts human free will by putting humans into a totally depraved state where they're incapable of doing otherwise. And reprobation is as unconditional as election. I basically agree with Dr. Thomas here, because God is the first and final cause, which sin, where sin is only the instrumental cause used as the means for reprobation. So if a Calvinist God has meticulously, if the Calvinistic God has meticulous control over everything you say, over everything, then you say he is not responsible for controlling it. Then I consider that a contradiction of A and not A. God not performing the activity of regeneration, of regenerating a sinner, is still making a decision not to do so. The decision to elect some individuals to salvation necessarily implies the decision not to save those that were not chosen. So, that's my view. So I lean towards the hyper Calvinist here, and yeah, I am guilty of following where it logically leads.
Sure. So could you leave this up?
Yeah.
So that I can walk through all these. Thank
Sure.
you. So Calvinists are left divided on important issues. Well, I don't think disagreement disproves anything, really. I mean, it does. It might, cause you to think about it more, which is fine. When you say the God of Calvinism is the author of sin and evil, I think I would precise it, and I would say, well, even if he created human beings with a complete autonomy, now does that mean, that he's making them do these sorts of things or something like that? You might call it implicatory, like your previous quote said, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't seem that he himself is doing that. The other thing is predestination, at least on Calvin's view, was in union with Christ. Since Christ was predestined from the foundation of the world, as John 6 talks about, people being handed over to Christ such that they would believe in an elect that would believe throughout time and space, then there would be conditions, namely believe, right? But what was unconditional was the demand for belief, right? We didn't determine, that sort of standard. God determined that. It's unconditional. We didn't make the rules, but we still do have the condition of believing. So I do take the more moderate view. Okay, so the third point, the God of Calvinism restricts human free will by putting humans into a total depraved state where they are incapable of doing otherwise. Here we have to talk about the principle of alternative possibilities. Why is this a problem? I would say because it has to do with moral praise and blame. I don't know if you received my book that I sent Skylar to send you, or just hit me up at nightmare8u@gmail.com and I'll send it to you directly. It doesn't really matter. I just want you to read it.
Yeah, I haven't, but yeah, I'll certainly take it.
There are two takes on this ability to do otherwise. One is conditional, the other one is categorical. And in almost all the cases that libertarians use, they equivocate. And I think you're equivocating here. I don't think, you're intending to, right? I'm not saying you're trying to deceive people or something like that. I just think maybe you're ignorant about these different categories. But here, the conditional ability to do otherwise is actually affirmed by the Calvinist tradition, as opposed to Luther. So, like, for example, I like to hear this question by Pine Creek, and I'll go to the third one. Pine Creek likes to ask the question, would a world being created without sin and evil be better, rather than a world that was created with sin and evil? And so classical Calvinism, and even John Calvin himself, affirmed this distinction between different kinds of necessity, right? That God could have done that, but there are different kinds of necessity, namely, let me look at the words here. Just give me a minute. I don't speak Latin, so I have to look at this up, but I had it prepared. Necessitatis consequentis and necessitatis consequentiae, which is involved back to Calvin's discussion with Pigius. I don't even know how to say that. I probably just murdered his name. So, there
Yeah, I just say Piggly. I say Piggly.
Piggly Wiggly. That Piggly Wiggly works for me too.
Yeah.
So let me go back over here real quick and look at where we are here. Oh, now I can't see the slide. Sorry. Thank you. So reprobation is as unconditional as election because God is the first and final cause, where sin is only the instrumental cause, uses the means for reprobation. Here, it looks like John Calvin's view differed, as you said earlier, I think a few times now. John Calvin viewed it as passing over, something that was impassive. But it certainly would seem, even if you take that view, even in your R.C. Sproul quote, right, that it would implicate God just by passively choosing some, by implication, at least logical entailment, he left out others. And so a question there would be, about God's desire to save everybody or something like that. So the last point here, if the Calvinist God has meticulous control over everything, then you say he is not responsible for controlling it. Then I consider that a contradiction of A and not A, God not performing the activity of regenerating a sinner, is still making a decision not to do so. So here, I think we're stuck in the principle of alternative possibilities again. Is it conditional or is it categorical ability to do otherwise here? The decision to elect some individuals to salvation necessarily implies a decision not to save those that were not chosen. Here, where I would agree with you. The only thing that I would add to this is that back in the Emeraldian debates in the Reformation period, with Moises Meritov and hypothetical universalists, and even Theodore Beza, who was a part of the Reformed tradition in this time period, started spreading things like Molinism to start with this, and they were actually interviewed. Well, at least Theodore Beza was. He was interrogated with this Molinism as a student of John Calvin, and he passed with flying colors, which is pretty interesting. Something to think about. But I think, I guess those are my responses. On the last point, I agree with you that it entails, right, if God passes over some, and then the instrumental cause is point 3, I think, said. Then, limited atonement would have to follow sufficiency and efficiency distinction, like John Calvin pointed out, but the Synod of Dort doesn't make that so clear.
Yeah. An observation I came to is that it seems like sin is greater or more universal than Christ's atonement on the cross. And what I mean by that is sin is a universal condition of all men due to the fall and their depraved state. So a depraved sinner is the default position, so to speak. Sin is unconditional, where election is conditional upon God's grace. So it seems like sin is unconditional for and reprobation. I shouldn't say reprobation, but
No, it's
our sinful nature is unconditional.
What? Get it straight for the. Oh, just kidding.
Yeah. Where Christ's atonement is conditional on God's activity. So yeah, so it seems like sin is almost is greater than Christ's atonement in that it's a default state of man.
Right. I think that's an important point because a lot of traditional Calvinists follow the doctrine of original sin in the sense, right, that like sin is like sort of an inherited genetic trade down, or sort of like catching a disease or some sort of an inherited trait. I would agree with you there, Floyd. I would just say the Westminster Confession of Faith says that we are born in a sinful condition with a sinful nature. But along with the Reformed tradition, they have another doctrine called Semper Reformata. Semper Reformata? Yeah, Reformanda. That is always reforming, changing and updating their ideas in accordance with what we find out aligns with the scriptures. So when I read a book like that of John Walton, and I know you've done excellent presentations on Genesis 1 through 3, so I'm sure you've read John Walton. His view seems to be that in Genesis 3, the curse really was directed at creation itself, not those people themselves. And so they would still be born in a sinful condition, which would affect their nature just in virtue of being born. Does that make sense, Floyd?
Yeah.
I mean, that's my view, at least. But you're absolutely right. The traditional view has it like sort of like just in virtue of being born or something like that. You know what I mean? You're damned.
I wanted to quickly jump in. We're going to probably wrap this up within about 10 minutes. Do you guys have anything you guys want to say? Any final questions? And we could always have you guys on another time. But I wanted to make sure that I want to give you guys an opportunity to say any final things you may have wanted to say tonight.
I have one more slide.
Oh, we have one more slide. Oh, I thought you finished it. No, throw it up there, my man.
I have one more slide, and it's real short.
I love it.
Real short. So yeah, let me finish up.
Please.
It says one line. All right. So in conclusion, Calvinists are left with a problem that is a mystery, insolvable, excruciating, that creates a tension, and a secret where they confess ignorance. So that is the end of my presentation.
I love it.
Thank you for presenting it. Let me return the question back to Skylar and Dr. Josh. You guys were so patient with us. Did you have any questions for us on any of this?
I don't think so. I think, I like the tone of this conversation, and it was just so, there's so much good information put out there. There wasn't really much I could add, to be frank. But I'm just so happy you guys came on tonight and had this discussion. You guys are just really cool sports about it. I mean, Floyd, you put a lot of work into that presentation. And then one way, I mean, the fact you came on into this room, with 3 non-believers, and we've had some really tough conversations on Calvinism, and it just shows me that you don't have any fear coming on and doing these things, which is awesome, right? So I wish there were more people like you. Cameron, I'm just saying, come on, Cameron.
He's like, cough, Cameron.
Nudge, wink, wink.
By the way, Cameron's still running. Okay. This is where I bring the conversation. Josh, what do you have anything for him, my man?
No, I was focusing on making sure I got the screens to switch back and forth every time the screen share went up. So we all appreciate Dr. Josh's hard work, because
it would look awful. It would just be me being like, let's just switch to Google Hangouts or something.
Absolutely. Give Dr. Josh some love. Go subscribe to Digital Hammurabi.
Yes, and that link is definitely in the description. Yeah, I think we could wrap it up, guys. Thank you everybody for watching. If you guys enjoyed, hit the thumbs up, share it, show some love. We got Patreon, we got a Discord that we don't really use, but it's there. Maybe you guys can make something magic happen with it.
Thanks for having me again. Thanks for having us.
No, it was my pleasure to have you guys on. All right, guys. Till next time, we appreciate everybody. Please subscribe and make the world a better place.